We are going to be reviewing the Topic 5 Schoology Basic Skills Test. So the first question on the skills test was 4 times -2. Now we know that the rule when we multiply a positive and a negative is that we get a negative out. So I know that 4 times 2 is -2 is going to get a negative number. 4 times 2 gives me 8, so I get -8 as my answer. Now my next question is -3 times -7. Now our rule is that if we have same signs, when we multiply them together, they give us a positive. So a negative times a negative gives us a positive, and 3 times 7 gives us 21, so we get positive 21. Now the next example says multiply and simplify the following, -2/3 times 3/5. So the first thing we want to ask ourselves is if this answer is going to be negative or positive, and we know that a negative times a positive gives us a negative, and then we want to see if there's anything we can cancel out. So I see that across both of my fractions I have 3, so I'm going to cancel those out. 3 divided by 3 gives me 1. And then 2 and 5 have no common factors, so I can't cancel those out. So I know that a negative times a positive gives me a negative. 2 times 1 gives me 2. I multiply across the top. I multiply across the bottom. 1 times 5 gives me 5. So my answer is -2/5. Now the next example just asks us if the solution to the following problem will be positive, negative, 0, or undefined. So we're not really trying to see what the answer is. We're just trying to see if we're going to get a positive or a negative answer out. So I'm going to break this into parts because I have 3 numbers. So let's start with the first 2 numbers, multiplying those together. Now I see that I have a positive times a negative, and a positive times a negative is going to give me a negative. And then I have another negative here that I still have to multiply. A negative times a negative gives me a positive. So I know that this entire expression, when I multiply it, is going to give me a positive number. So positive times negative gives me a negative. Then the negative from these 2 numbers times the next negative ends up giving me a positive. Now example 5, we start looking at division, but division rules are exactly the same as multiplication rules when it comes to integers. So -8 divided by -2, first 8 divided by 2 gives me 4. A negative divided by a negative gives me a positive, so that's going to give me positive 4. The next one I have a positive divided by a negative. My rule for positive divided by a negative, different signs, is that I get a negative, and then 15 divided by 3 gives me 5, so this is going to give me -5 as my answer. The next example asks me, what is the reciprocal of 2/7? Reciprocal just really means flip the numbers in your fraction. So the reciprocal of 2/7 would be 7/2, and you could write this as 7/2, or you could write it as a mixed number. 2 goes into 7 3 times, so my big number in the mixed number is going to be 3. Denominator always stays the same, and then I can use the C method to figure out my number on the top. 2 times 3 gives me 6, and then I have 1 more to make 7, so that means I'm going to have 3.5. So I could write the reciprocal of 2/7 as 7/2, or as 3.5. So my next example is 4/5 divided by -3/8. First thing I want to think about is if my answer is going to be positive or negative. Because I'm taking a positive divided by a negative, different signs, I'm going to get a negative out. And then I'm going to have to use my division rules for fractions. So when I'm dividing fractions, my rule is keep, change, flip. So I'm going to keep the first number the same. I change division to multiplication, and I change -3/8 to -8/3. So I flip the last fraction. I make it its reciprocal. Then I want to see if anything cancels out. Now in this case, nothing cancels out, so I take 4 times 8, which gives me 32. 5 times 3 gives me 15. And like we said before, because we took a positive times a negative, that's going to give me a negative answer. Now, next thing I want to do is write that as a mixed number. So 15 is going to go into 32 evenly 2 times, because 2 times 15 is 30. So my answer is still going to be negative. My big number is 2. Denominator stays as 15. And to figure out the numerator, the top number, I take 15 times 2 to get 30, and I see that I have 2 remaining before I get to 32. So the top number, the numerator, is going to be 2. So my answer is negative 2 and 2/15. For the next example, it says, which of the following quotients have the same value? So one important thing that we want to look at is thinking about quotients as a division problem. So if I were to take a negative divided by a positive, negative 1 divided by 2, that would give me a negative. A positive divided by a positive, well, that gives me a positive. A positive divided by a negative, different signs, that's going to give me a negative. And a negative divided by a negative gives me a positive. And so I see that my negatives are going to have the same answer. And then with the very last one, it's negative 7 plus 5 times negative 2. So this is where we get into order of operations. Order of operations, we use PEMDAS, and we always want to think about if we're done with each step before we move on to the next step. So starting off with parentheses. Parentheses means simplifying anything inside the parentheses. And I do have parentheses here, but nothing to simplify, so I don't have my parentheses step. I don't see any exponents. Those are like the little numbers on top of the big numbers. So we don't have exponents. Next we get to multiplication and division. And when I read this, I see that I have negative 7 plus 5 times negative 2. So I'm going to have to do multiplication first. So I'm going to underline my step. 5 times negative 2, positive times a negative gives me a negative, so I get negative 10. And then I rewrite everything else exactly the same. I'm going to leave parentheses around the negative 10 so I can distinguish that and the addition sign. And now all that I have left is negative 7 plus negative 10. Now we know that when we add same signs, the rule is that you add and keep the signs. 7 plus 10 gives me 17. And my answer is going to be negative, so I get negative 17. Same signs, you add and keep the sign.